Today we finish the book of Ezra, chapters 9 and 10, and begin the book of Nehemiah, chapters 1, 2, and 3. So I'll try to summarize it quickly. Anyway, in chapter 9, Ezra has heard about a lot of different things, and then he finds, it says, the people of Israel have not separated themselves from the people of the lands and their abominations. Some of the men have intermarried. Some of the women have intermarried. And this was against what God had commanded way back when. And when Ezra finds out that there are many who have intermarried, it says he tears his garment and his mantle, pulls hair out from his head and his beard, and sat appalled. And this intermarriage, Israelites, Jews with people from other nations. And I mean, years ago, a Norwegian and a Swede couldn't marry. You're a Catholic and a Protestant. And I mean, and there are still some people who are 100% of a nationality. And there's nothing wrong with that. But again, on the other hand, is there anything wrong with a Norwegian and a Swede marrying? Or, we have so many mixed nationality, mixed race marriages, and and is there anything really wrong with that? I mean, I don't think so. But anyway, for the Jews, and for the Jews still today, the Israelites, it's still, they can track this back to God, that God would say, you are my chosen people, and and so anyway, Ezra is appalled by the fact that some of the Israelites have fallen in love and married other people, other nations. And he prays to God, "Oh my God, I am too ashamed and embarrassed to even talk to you about this." But he does. He prays to God, and what shall we do, And, what shall we say to this? We have forsaken your commandments, which you commanded, and all of that. And comes to the conclusion then, in chapter 10 begins, when Ezra prayed and made confession, weeping and throwing himself before the house of God, a very great assembly gathered to him. And all of this happens, and the people say, we have broken faith with our God. They understand the plight that Ezra is in, the prayers that he's offering to God, but the outcome of this is such a sad thing, I think, because verse 9 of chapter 10, all the people of Judah and Benjamin assembled, and they said, we will do, Ezra says you have trespassed and married foreign women, increase the guilt of Israel, now make confession. And they all say, it is so, we must do as you have said. And then the rest of this chapter pretty much talks about the naming many of the Israelites who have married foreign women. And this this book ends on such a sad note, I think. The very last verse, all of these had married foreign women, and they sent them away with their children. I think about that. It just makes you hurt. These people, men and women alike, sending their spouse and their children away. I mean, you are no longer a part of me. You are not, And it just, we see so much in our world today of broken families and everything, and of the hurt and of everything that goes on within that. And here we look at this part of what God had told the Israelites, and the Israelites, in order to be faithful to God, send their wives, their children away. And it just plain hurts. But that's the way this book ends. And it's, the people, the Israelites, have been given authorization to return to Jerusalem, to return to their homeland. And, they no longer have to be, scattered around, but they can go back to their homeland, to Judah, to the land that God had given them. But then all of these other things come back to haunt them as well. And I just cringe with some of the rigidity that is here. But it is a reminder that there isn't any really black, and there isn't a gray area, rather, in the law. It's, this is the law, this is breaking of the law. And the Israelites understood their breaking of the law. And but it's still such a sad, sad thing. Nehemiah begins with a person, Hanani, coming to Nehemiah and telling him of the plight of the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem, with the walls broken down around Jerusalem, with the devastation that is still there, with the plight of the people, and just the terrible aftermath of the destruction and of the fall of Jerusalem, and how everything is no more. I mean, they had, as we read Ezra, they rebuilt the temple and different things that happened and stuff, but the walls of Jerusalem were still open and devastation was there. And Nehemiah hears these words, and he hears of the plight of the people, and he prays then to God, O Lord God of heaven, great awesome God, and let your ear be attentive. And now I pray before you for your servants, for the people of Israel. I pray before you for them. And, it's a prayer of intercession, not a prayer for himself, but a prayer for the people. And for what should he do? He says, both I and my family have sinned. We have offended you deeply. Remember the word that you commanded if you are unfaithful, and so he's reminding God, he's reminding himself, but he's praying for the people, wondering, well, what should we do? He says, verse 11, O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. And then chapter 1 ends with, at this time, I was cupbearer to the king. So there's Nehemiah, who ends up being a prophet, a person who does much of God's work, was the cupbearer to the king, the person that would, make sure that the wine was okay to drink, that somebody wasn't trying to poison him, but, he would hand the cup to the king after he made sure that it was safe, But he came to the king to serve that in his position as cupbearer one day, and as he handed the cup to the king noticed that he looked extremely sad. This is in chapter 2. And the king says, this isn't normal for you. You don't normally look sad like this. So what's going on in your life? And Nehemiah explains to the king of the walls in Jerusalem broken down, and of the need of the people there that have returned, and how they are, not safe, and everything that's going on. And he asks, so the king says, what would you request? So then I prayed to the God of heaven, he again says, so what should I do? What would you have me do, Lord God? And then he goes back to the king, if it pleases the king, let your servant, send your servant along with letters of authorization, so that the walls of the Jerusalem might be rebuilt. And then the king says, well, how long are you going to be gone? And he says, I think it's 3 days, or whatever. It wasn't a very long time anyway, and it's not nearly long enough. But 3 days, I guess, comes up after he'd been there for 3 days, in verse 11, he got up during the night and he went around the walls. During the night, I don't understand that for sure, but maybe to see what security there was there, to see how open the city was. We got up during the night, I and a few men, and we went around and we inspected the gates, and so all the gates that had been broken down and destroyed by fire and trampled. And he inspected the wall, and then he went back and he entered by the valley gate to return again. And then he said in verse 16, I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, or the officials of the work that they were to do. And then, he says to them, beginning in verse 17, that, Jerusalem lies in waste and rubble, and we will now begin rebuilding the walls. And, verse 18, the people say, let us start building, and exclamation mark, excited. Yeah, let's do it, and this is good for us and for our city. But there is opposition to that as well. And, the Shambalat and a couple others, what are you doing? What do you think you're doing? Are you rebelling against the king? And then Nehemiah shows him the the letters of authorization from the king to do this very thing, to begin rebuilding the walls. And then in chapter 3, we hear and read about the different priests working with other priests to rebuild the sheep gate and the garden gate and this gate and the old gate. And so chapter 3 goes through and tells us of the different groups that are rebuilding different sections of the wall. And it was a process that, it took quite some time to rebuild all of this wall. It wasn't just boom, it's done, but there was much work to do, and in many areas. And the people worked together, one group here, one group there, and all together then we're making some progress. And that's where we end today. Between the upper room and the corner of the sheep gate, the goldsmiths and merchants made repairs. That's where we end today with the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem.